Hi everyone, and welcome to lecture 3. So in the third lecture of what is the meaning of life, we're going to be looking at the question of death or immortality. So we'll be looking at people who say that death is necessary for meaning in life, and that if we don't die, and if we were to live forever, we would, as a result, have meaningless lives. And then we'll also look at people who think that the fact that we die would render our lives meaningless. So there it seems that eternal life is necessary, or eternal or immortal life is necessary for meaning in life. So far in the course, we've focused mainly on Wolff's fitting fulfillment view. And the way I want us to talk about death and immortality is as an objection to the fitting fulfillment view, or as presenting a worry to the fitting fulfillment view, even if it's not a full-blown objection. Perhaps it needs to be worked out a bit more. I mentioned this a bit at the end of the last lecture, but today we're going to look in more depth at the thought that death or immortality pose a problem for the objectivist. So on the one hand, like I said, we're going to look at the idea that death renders our lives meaningless, and we'll wonder whether this is in fact an objective condition on a meaningful life, that our lives don't end and that we don't die. So the fact that we do die objectively makes our lives meaningless. We'll wonder whether that is in fact a problem for the objectivist, of which Wolff's view is a form of. So remember, again, this is more or less challenge 3 that we talked about in the introductory lecture. But we're also going to look at another challenge, like I said, that immortality, or the not dying or having an eternal life, would also render our life meaningless, because people have also argued this. And this might, in fact, present another challenge, not a challenge we talked about in the introductory first lecture, but another challenge nonetheless. And perhaps this was a challenge that some of you thought of in the engagement exercise and entered that. That hasn't happened yet because I'm recording this before these are released, so I have no way of knowing. But I'm going to assume that some of you have had the foresight to consider this to be another challenge to having a meaningful life. So really, here the general worry that we're going to talk about in more detail in the second part of the lecture is that an immortal life is a boring or tedious life, because basically it will go on so long that you'll not find any interest in anything you do, and everything will become boring and repetitive, such that nothing's really going to matter to you, and you're never going to feel fulfilled. And so that will render your life meaningless. So you won't feel like you're doing anything that's worthwhile anymore, and then your life is meaningless. At least on the fitting fulfillment view, because this has a subjective component that says you have to feel fulfilled to have a meaningful life, where the feeling of fulfillment is a necessary condition, a necessary but not sufficient condition on having a meaningful life. So let's start by thinking why death might make our lives meaningless. Why think that death does? This was obviously challenge 3, so there's obviously a bit of intuitive pull to thinking that the fact we die and all our achievements and all our friends and family and all the nice things we've done for them and all the memories of ourselves will eventually disappear. You may have had this worry, and this worry is shared by many people, including the Russian author Leo Tolstoy. So I've got a quote from Tolstoy as cited in Metz. If you look this up, you'll find that this quote itself is within a larger piece, and the translation is usually quite different. So I found 2 different translations into English from the original Russian, but I think we'll get the point nonetheless. So Tolstoy says, sooner or later, there would come disease and death. They had come already to my dear ones and to me, and there would be nothing left but the stench, stench and worms. All my affairs, no matter what they might be, would sooner or later be forgotten, and I myself should not exist. So why should I worry about all these things? So obviously there, Tolstoy's getting a little bit, emotional, a little bit, angsty. He wasn't a teenager at the time; he was a little bit older, but this kind of existential angst can be experienced by older people. think he was 40 or 50 at this point, and after he'd become a good author, and he was starting to look back on his life and think, what was the point of any of that? So he's feeling a strong sense of disillusionment. But Tolstoy's thought here seems to capture what I was trying to get at with challenge 3. And it's a common thought that, well, what's the point of anything? What's the point of even trying if we're going to die anyway? What's the point of aiming for this great achievement if it's all going to turn into dust at the end anyway? If it's not going to last forever, then what's the point? So that's Tolstoy's thought there. So I think there may be different ways of understanding Tolstoy, but one way of understanding him is that he thinks that because nothing's going to last forever, there's no meaningfulness. And so this, he's including himself in this, like he's going to die, his family's going to die, no one's going to be around to remember him, no one's going to be around to remember his works. Everything then seems pointless and meaningless. So if we understand Tolstoy that way, it seems that he is endorsing the following necessary condition or requirement on meaningfulness, and that is that meaningfulness requires things to last forever. If things don't last forever, then there's no meaningfulness. This might just be your own life. Maybe you have to last forever, or maybe it's your achievements. We'll think about both as we go through. But the idea is that, if we die, then perhaps our lives are meaningless. And if all our achievements are eventually turned into dust and forgotten, then maybe those are meaningless too. And in turn, that's going to make our lives another way in which our lives might become meaningless. So let's wonder, is this claim plausible? Do you think it's plausible that meaningfulness requires things to last forever? So Susan Wolf and Thaddeus Metz both think it's not. So we perhaps come across Wolf's reasons, at least implicitly in the earlier lecture, why not? But Metz, in his book Meaning in Life, and also in his Stanford Encyclopedia entry, gives his reasons for thinking it's not. And they're going to consider here, again, they're going to pull back up the cases from lecture 1, which were also discussed in lecture 2. People like Blob, people like the useless people, the trust fund party girl, Sisyphus fulfilled, though I may not have talked about them yet. I'm forgetting what I added into the first lecture and what comes later on. But in any case, people who, they say, both Metz and Wolf and others who defend objectivism say, look, we'll look at certain lives and it's clear those lives are meaningful. We look at other lives, it's clear those lives are meaningless. And we compare two lives and sometimes it's clear that one life is more meaningful than another. And this, they think, only makes sense if there are objective facts about meaningfulness. If there was no objective facts about meaningfulness, they would all be on a par. We'd judge them all to be the same. So there's at least some sense in which these things are matter. So for Wolf, she focuses more on how it doesn't matter that we're small, tiny specks on a slightly bigger speck in a huge, uncaring universe. For her, what matters is that we can access objective value. We can bring about things which are objectively valuable. We can pursue worthwhile activities, create great works of art, create great monuments. These things are just objectively valuable, according to her. And she thinks that because of this, at least implicitly, because of this, because she doesn't actually directly engage with the worry about death or immortality, but we can extend her reasoning here. For her, it seems that she's going to say, look, it doesn't matter if we're going to die or whether we're immortal, we still engage in worthwhile activities. And we intuitively agree that certain things are more worthwhile than others. So there must be some objective fact about worthwhileness. And if we're able to bring about these objectively worthwhile things, then the fact we die, we turn into dust, doesn't really matter. But let's try and perhaps be charitable to Tolstoy's claim. Perhaps this misunderstands his claim. Maybe there's another way of thinking about his claim. Maybe he's not saying that exactly. Maybe he doesn't think that meaningfulness requires things to last forever. Perhaps you can even accept that meaningfulness exists at particular times. Perhaps that he can accept that his works, his great works, are meaningful during his life and whilst people remember him. Maybe that's not what he's talking about. Maybe he's worried about meaningfulness lasting over time. And so maybe what he really thinks about when he thinks about meaningfulness, he's thinking of something that doesn't just exist in particular moments, but exists over time, exists in the future. So if his life is meaningful now, then it should be meaningful forever. When people think back to him, it should be meaningful. So it's all about this kind of persistence of meaningfulness. And to get a little bit of a grip, a bit more of a grip of what I'm thinking of here, got this nice diagram. So let's imagine your life. So you have your birth here, you have your childhood. In each slice here, it's supposed to just be, it could either just be a particular moment in time or an extended period. So the birth, be the day of your birth, the experience, the time you were born. The slice here, the time slice is your whole childhood, let's say. And then later on, after your childhood, there's a time when you committed, you performed a meaningful act. That could be some point in when you're a teenager or when you're an adult. And, over time, at a later point in time, this meaningful act contributes to your life being meaningful. It doesn't matter what the meaningful act is. It's just something that makes your life meaningful. Feel great. There's more moments in your life where things don't happen, then a meaningful act again, more moments, and things are continuing to be meaningful in your life. Things are going great. Tolstoy here could be thinking, oh, yeah, my life is great. It's wonderful. Nothing happens here. Nothing happens here. Oh, you die. Perhaps here, what Tolstoy is worried about is so even if my life ends up being meaningful up until my death, when I die, that meaningfulness just goes away. It's fine for my life to had been meaningful, but what I want is for that meaning to exist beyond my death. One way for your life to continue to be meaningful is for people to remember it and for it to inspire people and for people to look at your great works and go, wow, you did great things. What a meaningful life you led. Oh, Tolstoy, you're fantastic. And that's certainly true for Tolstoy now, right? We still remember all his acts. And that might be true for all the great things that you go on to do. But after you die, things keep going on. Things keep going on. Things keep going on. You're still dead at this point. All this life is going on without you, and people are, doing new great things and getting on with it. Life goes on. Life goes on. There's a certain point in the future where you're no longer remembered. Type 1 remembered there. Try to remember to fix that. But the point here is that at some point in the future, it seems that you won't be remembered anymore. And Tolstoy maybe is worrying about this. He's worrying about the fact that, okay, I'm doing wonderful now, but at some point after my death, people won't remember me. We don't remember all the people from the past. We remember some people. We remember people like Homer, Plato, but maybe at some point in the future, we don't remember them. Maybe they've all been replaced by new people. Maybe we stop remembering Tolstoy as a result. And at that point that perhaps Tolstoy thinks that his life becomes meaningless because no one remembers him anymore. And so maybe you're not so worried about about being remembered, but at a certain point in the future, of course, it's supposed that it's thought that the universe will itself die. And this is the heat death of the universe. So at some point, even if you think meaningfulness will last beyond people remembering you, maybe you might worry about the end of time and the end of the universe and everything, going away. Maybe that might affect whether you think things are meaningful or not. I don't know if Tolstoy knew about the heat death of the universe, but if you thought about everything ending and that having some effect on whether his life and his works were meaningful, it seems like this might be the kind of thing that he might have had in the back of his mind, even if he wasn't really thinking of it in the way that scientists do now. So again, maybe Tolstoy's thought is that meaningfulness doesn't continue once we're dead and no one remembers us, because we can't create new meaning. And once no one remembers us, then were our acts really meaningful? If that's what he thinks, then he seems to be thinking that being remembered is necessary for meaningfulness. So meaningfulness is not just about doing wonderful achievements. Perhaps it's also about actually being remembered. You actually have to be remembered for those things to count as meaningful. So there might be other necessary conditions for meaningfulness, but perhaps being remembered is at least necessary. So even if our life was meaningful at the time, during our life, perhaps it's necessary for people to know that. They have to remember back to our life and go, yes, that was a meaningful life. Yes, Tolstoy led a meaningful life. But if we think about that point in the future where no one remembers Tolstoy, no one remembers us, for example, then maybe our lives don't have any meaning because we're not remembered. So here's important to distinguish between the two claims. So we have the claim about being remembered. So scratch that. I just want to focus here on the claim about meaningfulness itself. So there's one claim about, maybe he thinks it's important that people know we had a meaningful life, but we still had a meaningful life. So maybe it's possible that people don't maybe it's possible that a life is meaningful, but no one knows about it. And he thinks it's important that people know it's meaningful, but maybe that doesn't affect whether we had a meaningful life. But a stronger claim is that a life isn't meaningful unless people know. So here, being remembered is in fact a necessary condition on meaningfulness, not just on the knowledge that people have a meaningful life. So I want to put that again because I don't think I put it as clearly as I could. So on the one hand, we have actually being remembered is necessary for meaningfulness. And if people don't remember you, your life is meaningless. And then there's a necessary condition on people knowing you had a meaningful life. So perhaps you had a meaningful life, but unless you're remembered, people won't know that. So it's clear that being remembered is necessary for knowledge that someone had a meaningful life. But what I want to focus on is a stronger claim, the first claim, that being remembered itself is necessary for meaningfulness. So perhaps the underlying thought here is that our lives have to sort of stand the test of time, and a meaningful life is one that really lives on into the future, lives beyond the person's life. So someone like Tolstoy might still have a meaningful life now because we still remember him and we remember his acts and we remember his works. But his worry is about that point where no one remembers him anymore and all his achievements and everything, turn to dust, so to speak. And the thought here is if something's not actually going to stand the test of time and we're aware that everything eventually will crumble and be forgotten, then they can't really be that meaningful. And that might have a retroactive effect. It might end up making life now meaningless because it's not going to be remembered all throughout time. But when it comes to the meaningfulness claim, the claim that being remembered is necessary for meaningfulness, it's not immediately clear why that's true. It does seem conceivable, at least, that there's a meaningful life that we don't know anything about. So if we were to imagine, perhaps there's a Gandhi or Martin Luther King, or Nelson Mandela, or Mozart, or one of these people who supposedly has a very meaningful life, we can imagine there's a person just like that, but we don't know anything about them. Does that make their life meaningless? It at least seems plausible. I mean, at least it's not obvious their life would lose meaning just because we don't remember it. So there seems to be something missing here. If Tolstoy can be taken as presenting an argument here, he seems to be missing a premise. He needs to argue that being remembered is necessary for meaningfulness. Perhaps all he's shown is that being remembered is necessary for knowledge of meaningfulness, but that's a kind of obvious claim that I don't think anyone's going to disagree with. If we don't remember that somebody, if we have no knowledge, if we can't remember that somebody had a meaningful life, then then we can't know. And there'll be like this person who's had a meaningless life and we know nothing about it. So it's not obvious that meaningfulness requires being remembered, right? What Tolstoy needs to do really is argue that type of value, meaningfulness, depends on people remembering. He hasn't really argued for that. Perhaps he's trying to draw on our intuitions and say that this is intuitive, but I think he needs to do a little bit more here. He needs to argue for this, flesh out how this makes sense. And one of the reasons he might need to do this is if we think of meaningfulness as a type of value, like other values, like moral value, aesthetic value, prudential value, then they don't seem to be like that. If you think about moral value, the fact that something's morally good or morally bad doesn't seem to change whether or not people remember certain things. Something's morally good or morally bad, or something can be aesthetically good or aesthetically bad, or prudentially good or potentially bad, regardless of whether anyone knows anything about it. Right? If it is morally bad to, slap penguins, but no one knows about that, it's still morally bad to slap penguins. regardless. It's just a moral fact. We don't need to remember that. We don't need to remember that, have any knowledge about that, for that to just be a moral fact. But if meaningfulness is different to that and requires this memory of the meaningful acts, then that needs to be shown, that needs to be fleshed out. I mean, perhaps the case can be made that meaningfulness is different, right? Perhaps this is going to be very speculative at the moment. I don't know anyone who's argued this in particular, so it's very much my own speculation, but let's try and think through a defense, how we might defend this. Perhaps there's a kind of social value that requires a community of agents for it to be instantiated. So this might be the kind of thing that, for many people, but not everyone, moral value is the kind of thing that just exists. And then communities of agents, human beings like ourselves, we access that value. We do morally good things or morally bad things. But perhaps meaningfulness is a more social value that really depends on that community. And it's not something that exists independently of there being this community of agents. It's something that arises from that community. And because of that, and perhaps that's in part why it requires those agents to remember lives for them to continue being meaningful, because meaningfulness is a value that arises from the community. And then this requires those agents to have some memory. This is very speculative, because I think there's still work to be done to show how we get from meaningfulness being a social value that requires a community of agents to then having the requirement that people remember those lives. But sometimes we have to start with speculative suggestions and then try and work out the gaps in our argument to make an argument. But it's something that at least should be worth considering, I think. If this is right, if this very speculative suggestion is right, this would explain why our lives cease being meaningful once they're being forgotten. Like, it's a social value that requires agents to remember. Once agents don't remember, the meaningfulness goes away. So here we have to distinguish between two things that I may have alluded to a little bit and not brought out quite distinctly. On the one hand, we have the thought that, as we're moving through time and we're forgotten, then our lives become meaningless. One way of interpreting Tolstoy is to say, well, at the point that our lives are forgotten, our lives from that point are then meaningless. But prior to that point, they were meaningful because people remembered us. And during our lives, we did all these activities which, were really worthwhile and good. But it's when we're forgotten that our lives are no longer meaningful. And so the meaningfulness of our lives doesn't persist into the future anymore. But Tolstoy seems to suggest a stronger claim, or at least the spirit of his claim seems to be more that not being remembered actually retroactively undermines any earlier meaningfulness, any earlier value that our lives had. So the worry here is that, we might have had meaningful lives whilst we were alive, and they might have seemed that way, but then we got to a certain point in the future, and then we were forgotten, and then that undermined the meaningfulness of our lives. So the meaningfulness of our lives was never concrete or firmly established. It was always dependent on us being remembered. And once we stopped being remembered, all that earlier meaningfulness went away. And it seems to be that maybe Tolstoy is worried about, is that he is going to be forgotten at some point, and because of that, nothing matters. But I mean, that's something that's quite a major claim that I haven't seen much argument for. It's kind of a worry that Tolstoy has, but he hasn't really fleshed out the argument. He hasn't given us reasons, I don't think, to really endorse it. Or even if we find some intuitive pull to it, he hasn't really fleshed out or explained how any of this makes any sense. So it's not clear that death makes life meaningless, and it's not clear likewise that being forgotten makes life meaningless. So it at least seems that even if Tolstoy is right, and that once we're forgotten, our lives are meaningless, it's not going to follow automatically that our lives are meaningless whilst we're alive. Perhaps our lives are perfectly meaningful whilst we're alive. But Tolstoy might want to go for the stronger claim still, but he needs to argue more for that. And I don't think we'd give a reason to think that death itself makes life meaningless. at least retroactively. Like death might stop our lives continuing being meaningful into the future, but it doesn't seem to make our lives meaningless whilst we're alive. And to just continue with a bit more of a speculative suggestion, perhaps meaningfulness is a bit like regret. So remember in section 2, lecture 4 on Williams and regret, Williams thought that whether something was worthy of regret depended on how things worked out. So if you took a particular decision and it worked out really well, you don't have to, that decision isn't worthy of regret, even if you did something morally bad. But if you do something morally bad and it works out really badly, then that is worthy of regret. Perhaps meaningfulness is supposed to work a bit like this and have this kind of similar structure. And so meaningfulness really depends on how things work out. That though needs to be argued for. And I think that needs, you've got a bit of work ahead of you. You can't just assert that. And the reason is partly to do with the burden of proof. So maybe this is something you've come across, maybe not. But often when we're talking about arguments, people will talk about, well, who has the burden of proof? And usually, if you're making some seemingly outlandish claim or a strong claim, the burden of proof is on you because it's a strong claim. But why should anyone accept this? Like, it's on you to give us reasons. And so if you want to argue that death makes life meaningless for Tolstoy type reasons, that death retroactively undermines value, or being forgotten, not being remembered retroactively undermines meaningfulness and makes our lives, again, confused about meaningfulness, is death retroactively undermines meaningfulness and then makes our lives meaningless, the burden of proof seems to be on you for that. Because, again, it's a strong claim. But it's also partly because we've been given a prima facie plausible case that death doesn't make life meaningless. So objectivists or hybrid theorists like Wolff and Metz, they've at least given us a plausible case that death and being forgotten doesn't make our lives meaningless. So if you want to respond to that plausible case, then you've got a bit more work to be done. So if you're coming in with an opposing stronger claim, you need to then do a little bit more to argue for that. And working out burden of proof can often be quite tricky, but I think in this case, it's a clear case of the burden of proof being on the Tolstoy type person who wants to argue that death or being forgotten makes life meaningless. So I think as it stands, challenge 3 is inconclusive. It doesn't mean it's completely undermined or refuted. I don't want to make such a strong claim, but it's at least inconclusive. The defender of challenge 3 would have a little bit more work to be done there. So I'll stop there and then we'll move on to